And in the next section, this says game loop. So I have a while, code, 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 code. And then this is the end of my while loop, right? So this all happens here. So this is a while true. This is an infinite loop. We were kind of cautioned against this in programming class, but it works here. Any thoughts as to why this works here?
Well, if I recall in the instructions, it explicitly tells you to create an infinite loop. So beyond that, I mean, maybe because the game keeps playing until it lands, so it has a definite end.
I agree with everything you just said. Number one, we were told to do it. And number two, the game takes care of ending itself, right? So we don't need to find that graceful ending in our program because, like in this example, on turn 79, the game just said, hey, the game is over. Your code has stopped running. And so I don't need to have that graceful ending.
Yep. It will allow us to end in a crash.
We still have that decision, but it's a little bit different than what I'm used to writing. Right? Does true equal true? And then if the answer is, well, the first one I pull is yes. So here's my terminator for end. So I guess if I ever get out of this loop, that's the end of the program, but it's probably not going to ever get out. But if it's ever false, I go to end. After I initialize input, I jump into my loop. And here, let me cheat just a little bit. If you give me that leeway here.
Granted.
Right, so this just gives me the same kind of flexibility that I took above with the initialize input. What is all the loop stuff? Well, I'm choosing not to care at the moment, right? This is, to me, this is that same thing we talked about earlier about just kind of getting your head around what that code does. And the same kind of advantage I got by collapsing these, right? A loop and a loop. What do they do? Well, I'll have to dig into that to understand, but now I know I initialize input and I do loop stuff. But that's probably not sufficient enough to understand what's going on in the code. Do you agree?
Fair.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm going to have to dig in a little bit more. But if I had multiple programs or multiple classes, this would be a great way to start, right? Just kind of start to map everything out. And then if there are areas where I said, okay, I'm going to choose not to care about this class, I can leave that do loop stuff in there up until I need to go in and debug some code.
Yep. So one question that I would probably have at this time, if I were looking at this for the very first time, would be, okay, where does a turn begin, right? So we were playing out over those 79 turns. Where does a turn begin? And then where does a turn end?
Yeah. So all of our turns are going to happen in this loop. And if we were an alien coming through, dropping down in our spaceship while somebody was debugging code, if you came in to this section, do loop stuff, you can't tell how many times you've been through the loop before, right? At this point, I can't tell if I'm on turn 2 or turn 78 of, our application up here.
Yep.
So let's go ahead, take my little cheat out of the way here. And the loop stuff that we have really breaks into two parts, at least in my mind. One is reading all the inputs. And then right now, the only other thing that happens, and this is just one line of code, so I can use the actual input output here. Or I'll use the olden days term, output 0, 3, right? Nothing more, nothing less. So first time I read the inputs, After reading inputs, I output 0, 3, then I come up and I do it all again. And one of the things that I actually like with some of the flowcharts are these connectors. And that just, because I don't want to come up and do initialize input again, because we don't initialize input again. And I don't want to connect it right to this decision tree. And so this connector allows me to have a space, and I don't need to have a letter in there. And the only thing it's useful for is an anchor point for some of these.
Very cool. And what is an anchor point?
So as I'm clicking and dragging through here, when I select one of these objects, no matter if it's the square or the parallelogram, these little red circles are places for me to begin to draw an arrow. And then the arrow can either end in space, and it's not connected to anything. So as I move things around, that arrow is not impacted. But if I connect that arrow to one of these other circles, or as you see it, highlight the entire object, when I anchor it to one of those little circles, now when I move that object around, all the arrows come and move with me to try to make it legible. You can see I can purposefully make things hard for people to see, but assuming I'm not an evil villain, I can make it a little bit easier to see there.
Nice. Definitely.
So this is a little bit more than loop stuff, but not much. And it might be enough.